All right, welcome back to the Powers on Sport podcast. It's 4th of July week. We're actually recording this interview actually on the 4th of July, and we are going to talk, we're going to get into all things conference realignment. Obviously, the huge news last week of UCLA, USC heading from the West Coast to the Midwest to join the Big Ten Conference, and no better person to talk all things USC with than the USA Today Trojan Wire editor, the one, the only, the 4th of July, the Joey Chestnut edition of 63 hot dogs. Apparently, Matt just told me he was playing injured with a bum leg. Welcome back, Matt Zemek.
Well, USC is going to be able to pay for a lot of hot dogs. We can be clear on that after this move. And I think, obviously a million different angles to discuss in all of this. But one thing is that, if you're thinking like USC betrayed the Pac-12 or USC and UCLA are responsible for the possible death of the Pac-12, if Oregon and Washington leave the Big Ten, that could be the death knell for the Pac-12. Or if Oregon and Washington do leave, maybe the conference still survives as a glorified Mountain West. Maybe Stanford and Cal stay. You add San Diego State and Boise State, and the conference is basically a glorified Mountain West, which still has the Olympic sports. Anyway, in terms of assessing blame for the possible death and obviously the clear diminishment of the Pac-12, it will never be as strong without USC football. There's only one person responsible for this. It's Larry Scott. No one else. It's not USC President Carol Folt. It's not USC Athletic Director Mike Bone. It's not Lincoln Riley. It is Larry Scott. And one thing that John Wilner, the excellent journalist for the San Jose Mercury News and the Wilner Hotline, the guy who broke this story on Thursday morning, one thing he has been very clear to emphasize in all of this, Jason, and people who are listening in on the Powers on Sports podcast, is that a few years ago, there was a chance for Larry Scott to just hand over the keys to ESPN. ESPN could manage the Pac-12 networks, manage the Pac-12 inventory. There was a direct and clear chance for Larry Scott to give ESPN control. Because when the Pac-12 networks were formed roughly a decade ago, the selling point among Pac-12 presidents and chancellors was that the Pac-12 was controlling the network. So like it controlled its own product. So every dollar generated by the Pac-12 networks when they were created went back to the conference. So there wasn't a middleman. There wasn't an ESPN. There wasn't Fox. There wasn't CBS. It was everything was controlled, and therefore all the revenue stayed within the Pac-12. That was the original concept. And 10 years ago, it made sense. Why cut in ESPN on the deal when you could keep all the loot yourself? But of course, that was before the DirecTV snag. That was before, Scott failed to make Pac-12 network more widely accessible across all platforms. But in terms of the original genesis, the original concept, a decade ago, why not? Why not try to, keep it self-contained, kind of like with what Notre Dame has. Notre Dame keeps every TV dollar for itself. Now, obviously, Notre Dame's in a different league compared to the Pac-12, but nevertheless, it was worth it for the Pac-12 to try that. It had the DirecTV part of the piece with Pac-12 networks worked out better, maybe then schools would have made a lot more money, but Larry Scott needed to bring home the DirecTV deal and he failed. But the concept wasn't really bad. But anyway, in 2018, 2019, as Wilner and other Pac-12 industry insiders have said, there was a new chance several years into the Pac-12 network arrangement for the conference to say, you know what? We tried it on our own. We tried it by ourselves, but now we need to hand over the keys to ESPN and take that money, but give ESPN control, because we're seeing the landscape changing. We're seeing how much ESPN and Fox control the chessboard. So if we want to stay solidly intact, safe, secure from any outside interventions or forces, we need to now admit that the time to do it on our own is over, and we need to let ESPN enter into this. So if Larry Scott had relented, which he obviously should have, and had given the keys to ESPN 4 years ago, the Pac-12 would still have USC and UCLA. The Pac-12 would still be fully intact. So Larry Scott just made horrible decisions. I think at the very beginning of his tenure, which was over a decade ago, he tried to bring Texas and Oklahoma into a Pac-16. That was a good idea, and the president shut it down. Texas also got cold feet. That's obviously another part of this, but the presidents in the Pac-12 shot it down. And so at the very beginning, Larry Scott was the visionary guy with the bold ideas who was trying to change the game. But then Larry Scott did not adjust as his tenure moved along. And he really needed to see how the winds were blowing. He needed to see that, I need to let ESPN take a cut of revenue in exchange for the long-term stability of the Pac-12. He didn't make that choice. That's why we are where we are today.
All right, a couple of the nuts and bolts things that the average viewer, maybe if they're not as dialed into the Pac-12, behind the scenes stuff. One, I heard a number of that USC UCLA was getting around $30 million a year in TV money. Is that currently? What is the kind of the breakdown of before they made the move? Kind of what was the breakdown of what each school in the Pac-12 was getting part of their TV deal?
In terms of the ballpark figure, that's pretty close to it. I think it might actually be 25 million a year, but yeah, it's somewhere around there. Just a few million. So like they're now poised to pull in 100 million a year.
I was going to say currently Big Ten teams are getting around 75 million currently, and it's probably going to jump to about 100 million when they renegotiate the rights deal. Obviously, now that you're going to have USC UCLA, the price just goes up a little bit higher.
That's right. So hey, like if you're USC or UCLA and Fox Sports basically says, here's $75 million a year. Let's be serious. Are you really going to turn that down? Right. Would anyone in the position of USC's administration or UCLA's administration turn that down? Let's just briefly, for a brief moment, let's look at UCLA for just a brief second. UCLA is in massive debt. UCLA has had significant debt problems. Like UCLA has been hemorrhaging cash, and UCLA is public, whereas USC is private. So like USC is in a much better financial position than UCLA. In terms of UCLA, you're desperate to get rivers and rivers of money. Right. And so like it was an absolute no-brainer for UCLA. But even with USC, Fox is just saying, hey, here's $75 million a year. No one would turn that down. And we just have to emphasize that if Larry Scott had made good decisions, if the Pac-12 had not fallen significantly behind the Big Ten in terms of annual revenue, if that gap had not increased, right, then the incentives would be different for USC and UCLA. Right. So again, Larry Scott created the situation. If he had partnered with ESPN a few years ago, which he had the chance to do, you wouldn't see this Grand Canyon-sized gap in revenue. Now, Pac-12 wouldn't be on the same plane as the Big Ten, but it would be a lot closer. You wouldn't have this $25 to $30 million a year valuation. It would probably be somewhere in the area of like 55 or 60 million. Right. Something that USC and UCLA could definitely live with. Their ledger sheet would be dramatically different. Yep. And it wouldn't be, they wouldn't be taking the step, right? Because this is introducing a whole set of complications for USC and UCLA, also for the Big Ten. I was surprised that this move was in all sports except beach volleyball. That's the one exception. But all the other Olympic sports, I was really surprised. I thought this would be just a football and basketball move. You're really going to ask all these Olympic sport athletes to travel to Big Ten locations for competitions? That's not what those Olympic athletes signed up for. They wanted to compete out on the West Coast. They wanted to go to the Bay Area, to Eugene, to Seattle. They didn't sign up for this. Yep. Yeah. So if you're inviting this kind of logistical headache, it better be for an absolute truckload of cash, but it also brings up just the sense of dissatisfaction USC and UCLA obviously felt to be willing to take on that logistical nightmare. Yep. They feel it's worth it, to get these mountains and mountains and mountains of cash. The speculation was everything was hunky-dory the last couple of months with the new Pac-12 commissioner, that they had a kind of a gentleman's agreement that they were going to stay. What changed in the last month or so, or is it just UCLA and USC
kind of playing their cards close to the vest and then just pulling the ripcord and getting out? I mean, because you heard reports that everybody was on board, new contract coming, hopefully with Fox here in the new negotiation period coming up, that everybody, USC and UCLA were okay staying. What changed in the last couple of months, especially with your new commissioner out there?
Yeah, so a couple of things here. First off, just the fact that Big Ten media rights negotiations were ongoing, and if they were working toward their conclusion, and so at USC and UCLA, I'm sure there was a sense of urgency. Whoa, before these media rights negotiations between Fox and the Big Ten conclude, we better get in on this, because what if these negotiations conclude and then, the Pac-12's media rights negotiations were set to occur next year,
right?
But only after the Big Ten finished. Like, the Pac-12 was in a next in line position. It could not negotiate concurrently with the Big Ten. The Big Ten got its media round first,
right?
And then the Pac-12 was going to have its chance. So there was mounting urgency on that front. But the other thing is, as John Canzano, the other really great Pac-12 journalist, he's based in Portland. He's also a radio host in Portland, but he reported that George Kliavkoff did not make an offer to USC and UCLA for an extra cut of media rights. Right. Now, Canzano himself said, I doubt this would have mattered. I doubt this would have affected the larger state of play. USC probably would have taken the Big Ten cash regardless. But if you are George Kliavkoff, and I think he's done a really good job in his first year, but this was clearly a mistake, you at least have to make an offer to USC and UCLA about getting an extra cut. And we've seen, Jason, over the past few days, all the revelations about media rights value. We've seen industry insiders say that, Oregon's and Washington's media rights value, for football aren't nearly as big as what many people expected, that the Big Ten, might not really view the media rights piece for Oregon and Washington as something which, makes it a no-brainer to invite the Ducks and the Huskies into the conference. Here's another whopper. You might really be surprised about this. Canzano talked to a former Fox insider, not a current Fox employee, but a former one. This former Fox executive told him that Stanford's media rights value is $45 million, Oregon's is $30. Wow. Now that blew me away. That's crazy. I can't believe that, but that's what a former Fox executive told John Canzano, that Stanford would actually bring more to the table than Oregon would. So a lot of these assumptions about media rights value in the Pac-12, like, that's the kind of thing that George Kliavkoff needs to know about, and it's the thing that he needs to operate on when he's trying to manage relationships with the various schools. So we've seen it's just a fact in terms of what the Big Ten value and what the Big Ten is able to put together in media rights negotiations. We've seen that the Big Ten has identified USC as significantly more valuable than Oregon.
Sure, with the LA market.
Absolutely. And so it might have hurt a lot of feelings throughout the Pac-12 and the various presidents and chancellors. But if you have one particularly valuable property, it's the same for the Big 12 with Oklahoma and Texas. If you have one or two really valuable properties, you need to give them more money if you want the conference to stay together. And you need to sell the other conference members on the value of making the king happy, so that everyone stays together. And George Kliavkoff, now again, he might not have been able to save this, because Larry Scott obviously put the Pac-12 in such a bad position. But if you're Kliavkoff, you have to at least make an offer to USC, giving them an extra cut of revenue. Not doing that is a clear mistake on his part. One of the few significant mistakes that Kliavkoff made in his first year as Pac-12 commissioner.
What does the Pac-12 do next? There's talk out there that potentially a Pac-12 Big 12 merger. Maybe you bring 5 or 6 of the big teams from the Big 12, combined with Oregon, Washington, the Arizona schools, Colorado, to make a kind of a Southwest out West kind of mega conference. Do you see that as a possibility, a Pac-12 Big 12 merger of some sort?
Yeah, so many things are in play here, and it's fascinating to sort through the different possibilities. There are reports, it's pretty much rumor at this point, but I mean, it's rumor that, makes sense logically that the Big 12 could make a play for the Arizona schools, Colorado, and Utah. Now, Colorado in particular makes all the sense in the world because Colorado used to be in the Big 12.
Right.
So Colorado could just go back to the Big 12, play in a region of the country where the travel, the geography fit. But then where would Utah go? So Utah becomes really intriguing. And if you're Utah, do you try to stay in the Pac-12? Do you try to make the move early to the Big 12 and find that early lifeboat? Or do you hold out hope that if you make the college football playoff this year, maybe your football brand is so valuable that you can go all the way to the Big 10? Utah faces a really interesting set of choices. Now, the Arizona schools, like the Big 12, makes sense for them in ways that the West Coast Pac-12 schools don't, because you're in a much redder state. The cultural and institutional fits are better than it's been known for quite some time that the schools based in the Bay Area and Oregon and Seattle merging with the Big 12, that's such a bad cultural and institutional fit. But the Arizona schools, they can be the exception in the Pac-12. So how those pieces of the puzzle fit together, it's going to be fascinating. The other part here is, what does Stanford think? What does Stanford really want to do? Because Stanford has just seen USC and UCLA send not just its football programs, but its Olympic sports to the Big Ten. Do Stanford and Cal Berkeley athletes want to be part of that? And so Stanford might think that the prestige of being in the Big Ten, the prestige of its football program is worth making a play for the Big Ten. But Stanford could also say, and I think this is very possible, you know what? We have our huge endowment. We want to stick with our Olympic sports. We want to keep those athletes happy. We want to keep those programs rooted in the West, traveling in the West. And so what's Stanford really thinking? That's really important because, as I alluded to earlier, if Oregon and Washington leave for the Big Ten, Stanford really becomes the central player in the Pac-12, and whether the conference survives in any form or completely splinters. If Stanford wants the Big Ten cash and the football prestige, then the Pac-12 is dead. Oregon and Washington obviously are important for the Pac-12 survival, but I think in many ways Stanford is the central piece. Because if Oregon and Washington lose, it's Stanford which will decide whether we want to form a glorified Mountain West, but with a robust Olympic sports presence, or if we should just all blow it up. And maybe Stanford becomes independent. That is something which has been whispered around here. So in many ways, what is Stanford thinking? What are Stanford's goals? What does Stanford want out of all of this? Stanford has resources. Stanford doesn't need an extra dollar the way UCLA did, or the way USC did. So Stanford is really, I think, a central point in terms of how that Pac-12, Big 12 puzzle shapes up. It's going to be fascinating to see. And the other thing we need to keep in mind with the Pac-12 and Big 12, ESPN has to give its blessing. ESPN is, obviously looking at what Fox is doing in the Big 10, and ESPN has to see what's attainable, what's realistic. And of course, that ESPN is thinking about, what if we can bring Clemson and Miami and Florida State to the SEC?
Right.
Yeah. And so, so what's ESPN's view of the chessboard and what's realistic? That's in the background. And ESPN has to give its approval of a Pac-12 Big 12 merger in order for that to happen.
And the two words that could ultimately dictate the future of the Pac-12 and in Oregon and Washington, the two words Notre Dame. If the Big Ten gets Notre Dame, they might not feel the need to have to go get Oregon and Washington. But if they don't get Notre Dame, maybe Oregon and Washington is the fallback for the Big Ten to combine them with USC UCLA. So you have a little more West Coast presence. The travel's not quite as bad because of the combinations, but Notre Dame, I think, will play a big piece in kind of the status of both Stanford, Oregon, and Washington. I think Notre Dame plays a big role in that.
it's really interesting that, Jason, that you bring this up. And obviously this is the first domino. You know, what does Notre Dame decide? Then you're going to see more movement after Notre Dame makes its decision. But one thing that really intrigued me is that John Wilner made the point over the weekend that if Notre Dame goes to the Big Ten, that might actually help Oregon and Washington. Now, like, that cuts against, I think, the conventional wisdom which emerged in the first 24 hours after UCLA's move to the Big Ten. But the line of argument from Wilner is that if Notre Dame does join the Big Ten, that means that the Big Ten is on the road to, you know, a mega conference meaning 20 or more members, and that you will need to add more travel partners. You'll need to add more geographical diversity to the conference if Notre Dame's part of the picture. And obviously you'll want more schools to travel to and from Notre Dame, to build that brand. But yeah, my line of thought was that if Notre Dame joins the Big Ten, that would be an impediment to Oregon and Washington joining the conference. So it's really fascinating to see that Notre Dame might create more Big Ten membership. It might not halt more Big Ten membership. And you know, I don't know which way that's going to go, but it's fascinating to see that this could work in different ways from different vantage points. Just speaking solely about Notre Dame, my opinion has been and still is that Notre Dame does not need to join a conference. And I don't see Notre Dame doing this, because if you think about it, if Notre Dame was given a chance to join the Big Ten several years ago, like the Big Ten's just had an open standing offer. Absolutely. You're welcome to join anytime you want. So if Notre Dame wasn't willing to split a revenue pie with 13 or 14 other members, why would Notre Dame split a revenue pie with 16 or 17 other members?
Right.
That doesn't make sense. And some people are saying, oh, Notre Dame has to find a lifeboat. Notre Dame has to shop itself around. I don't understand that. What, like, Notre Dame has an exclusive TV deal with NBC, and Notre Dame could continue to leverage that deal with NBC where it keeps all the loot. I do not get the argument for why Notre Dame has to now suddenly find a conference partner. I mean, Notre Dame has had so many chances, and I don't see why the calculus is meaningfully different for the Irish this time. So, and it could be that, you know, maybe with all the shifting winds that Notre Dame finally thinks, you know what, this is the time. Big Ten makes geographical sense. So it's possible, but until proven otherwise, I think that Notre Dame, it really believes in independence. It really likes independence. I haven't really seen anything to say, whoa, this really changes the game. Notre Dame has to get off the dime. I'm not seeing it. I just don't get that part of the national conversation.
Great insight, Matt Zemek, editor, USA Today Trojan Wire, talking all things Pac-12, USC, UCLA to the Big Ten. Want to transition to a couple other things before we get you out of here. You're based out in Phoenix. What's the chatter with Kevin Durant potentially coming to Phoenix? A lot of chatter that he wants Phoenix, Miami, potentially are his two landing spots that he'd really like to explore, potentially Golden State as well. But what are your thoughts? What's the chatter out there with KD potentially going to Phoenix, potentially with a DeAndre Ayton, Mikal Bridges, and some assets going back to Brooklyn?
That's the only thing people are talking about in this town right now, because, you know, they know that the Cardinals fall apart in December under Cliff Kingsbury. The Diamondbacks and Coyotes aren't worth talking about. And of course, ASU football is in the gutter under Herm Edwards with NCAA sanctions awaiting. So, like, this is the sports topic in Phoenix 24/7. And I mean, let's be honest, after seeing how the team imploded in Game 7 against the Mavericks, this is the obvious answer. This is the obvious solution, that you get a big dog like Kevin Durant, who, first off, isn't going to allow an implosion like that to happen. But secondly, because of his ability to stretch the floor, you know, imagine what that does for Devin Booker and Chris Paul to be able to attack the basket. You know, it would just be an amazing transformation of what's already a good offense, and it would become absolutely dynamic in so many different ways. And it would obviously elevate the Suns from, you know, one of several Western Conference contenders to pretty clearly the best team
Yeah,
in the Western Conference. Well, so I mean, we never got to see the Suns play the Warriors in the West Finals, but when you look at how limited the Dallas Mavericks were, it was such an indictment of the Suns. Like, wait, you lost to this team, when Golden State just easily mopped up the Mavericks in 5 games. But had the Suns played the Warriors, that probably was going to be a long series. That probably was going to be a 6 or 7 game series, precisely because DeAndre Ayton was going to provide matchup problems for the Warriors that did not exist with Dallas. Dallas did not have the low post hammer to give the Warriors problems inside, but Phoenix did. So that was going to be a tough matchup. So I think that Durant to Phoenix would make the Suns number 1 in the West, and not just number 1 in a regular season, but you put the Suns with Durant up against the Warriors
with Booker
next year. I would give the advantage to the Suns with Durant on the court and the advantages that he brings to that roster. So obviously, if you're the Suns, you do whatever it takes. I think it's pretty clear. You give up the other assets, you give up the other pieces to bring Durant to the Valley. You want that NBA championship, and you're not. It's not as though you have Chris Paul for much longer. That body is limited, and one of the things we see how that body breaks down at playoff time repeatedly. So one of the other things about bringing in Kevin Durant, Jason, is that if you have him, you can play Kevin Durant and Devin Booker for extended minutes during the regular season, and you sit Chris Paul during those minutes, so that Chris Paul just has to play 20 minutes a game in the regular season so that he is supremely fresh. You cannot play Chris Paul 35 minutes on a regular basis during the regular season. You basically give him kind of like a half vacation for the 6 months so that he has an absolutely full fuel tank in late April. And so getting Kevin Durant provides the ability for the Suns to just use Chris Paul at that lower minimal level. It really enables them to, instead of playing the regular season all out, it enables them to go at half speed in the regular season. Maybe you don't even get the number 1 seed. We've seen how that doesn't matter. The Warriors were a 3 seed. The Celtics were not the number 1 seed in the East. We should have learned this from the 2016 Golden State Warriors when they won 73 games. They were absolutely spent at the very end, and LeBron was able to catch them in the finals. So the Suns can just play the regular season at half speed, cruise into a number 2 or number 3 seed, and then you have a full strength Chris Paul for the playoffs with Booker, with Durant, and then you can go win the first NBA championship, which everyone in this town so desperately wants.
All right, last thing I'll get you out of. We're both tennis fans. This is Wimbledon. We're in the right in the middle of Wimbledon. We're getting down to about the round of 16 quarterfinals for both the men and the women. I want to talk about Nick Kyrgios. What a dichotomy of stuff. Uber talented. Mentally, we're not sure where he's at. I know he's had some mental health issues over the years. There's been a lot of accusations of his effort level, his physical conditioning, all that stuff. Kyrgios is making a big run here into the quarterfinals. He had a very wild match the other day with Tsitsipas, where there's a lot of different stuff going on between the players during the match, code violations, all this kind of stuff. Talk to me about Kyrgios in Wimbledon in general.
Well, the reality of the situation hasn't changed for Nick Kyrgios. That, in terms of year-round results, he's never going to reach the next level as long as he doesn't, tend to his body, as long as he doesn't put in the hard work in terms of physical fitness. But that's the year-round question. In terms of being able to win one tournament of real significance, it has always been Wimbledon, because on the grass of Wimbledon, which supremely rewards a big serve and a big game, like that was always the one tournament where Kyrgios could come off the street, just serve like a demon for 2 weeks and make a real run at the title. So that's what we're seeing here. And of course, once he got past Tsitsipas, Nakashima and now Garin in the quarters. So like, that's a dream draw. That's as good a draw as he possibly could have hoped for. And we're on this collision course likely with Rafael Nadal in the semifinals. And so can he get past Rafa? And Rafa, he's dealing with the foot problems. He spilled every last ounce of energy he had to win the French Open.
Right.
So Kyrgios has a real shot in that match. And so the idea of Kyrgios making the final, it's not absurd at all because of the draw, because of Nadal's physical condition. It's really right there for Kyrgios. I mean, he's a pure showman. He's a bad boy. He provides maximum entertainment value and great theater. Just the main thing is that for fans is that we need to separate what he can do at Wimbledon with how he fares, on a weekly, monthly basis in terms of the whole tour. The whole tour, not a factor, but at Wimbledon, he can be a factor. And this is his one chance. Like some of the other grass court specialists of years past, like Richard Krajicek, Goran Ivanisevic, they weren't good at the other three majors, but they were good at Wimbledon. That's right. Kind of where Nick Kyrgios fits in the larger puzzle of men's tennis.
It's not sad, but it's disappointing as fans of tennis. He could be the personality of all personalities on the tour if he would just settle down a little bit when it comes to his antics and all his stuff off the court and even in match stuff that he does, because his talent level is very good. He's a top 10 player.
He's insanely talented.
Yes. I mean, ground stroke wise, he's a good hitter of the ball. He showed some real grit today when he beat Nakashima in the 5th set, going 5 sets. I mean, he's got more than just a serve. He's not just a server. He's got some skills. He's got supreme personality that the tour needs. There's not the showman of McEnroe and Connors and Eli Nastase back in the day. He's that guy. He could be and the fans love him. The fans still love him, even with all his antics that he goes through on the courts and off the courts.
No doubt. I mean, and yes, he is more than just a server. Like his ability to hit reflex volleys and change direction with his forehand from the back of the court. He has incredibly soft hands. Like his touch and feel. Like he doesn't just blast the ball either. Like his ability to hit angled shots, hit the ball with all sorts of spins. He has amazing feel for the game. And it's just, it is a shame that he doesn't fully invest himself in the physical fitness part of the sport, because he has top 5 level talent. He has the talent to rival Nadal and Djokovic.
Yeah.
And if he only dealt with the physical side, because, Nadal and Djokovic, they are fully fit, or at least they put themselves through the ringer in terms of their conditioning, their stamina. They're able to hold up under, a withering assault from the other side of the court. And that's what's turned them into, 22-time major champions. If only Kyrgios could look at that and say, hey, if I want to be that kind of champion, I need to be the fittest athlete on the court. And he doesn't care. And similarly, mentally, he doesn't care what other people think about him.
If he would just tighten up mentally a little bit, not saying you can't be charismatic and all that, but he just goes off the edges too quickly and too easily. Yep. He throws games, he'll throw sets, things like that the top players just don't do. Those are the things, if he could just tighten up, shrink the margin of those things happening, reduce that by 50%. Don't even have to eliminate it completely.
That's right.
Just reduce it by 50%, the amount of outbursts and antics, he would be a star, a global star, because when you hear him talking after matches, he's very intelligent. He gives credit. He's not, bombastic. He's very, he just for whatever reason during these matches, he just snaps at times, and it's just a shame to watch sometimes when he melts down.
Yeah, he just doesn't care about those things. He would rather just be totally free and unrestrained in terms of his personality. That's what matters most. He just doesn't want to be inhibited in any way. That's his number one priority.
It's crazy, man. All right, Joey Chestnut won his 15th hot dog eating contest on the 4th of July, dropping 63 dogs. Matt, if I put how many hot dogs could I put in front of you, Matt, and you could take care of business if you had to?
Let's just put it this way. I'm 46, so not nearly as many as I could when I was 26. Let's put it at that.
Well, Matt, I appreciate it, man. Happy 4th of July week. I know you're going to be busy doing all kind of stuff getting ready for training camp to start here in the college football world in about a month. Obviously, all this other stuff with all the conference realignment going on. Matt Zemek's all over it. Give out the Twitter feed, Matt, to the audience as well, and where they can find you online with your work.
Well, hey, just, at Trojans Wire and on Twitter, that's just Trojans Wire, and our website, trojanswire.usatoday.com. Hey, you want realignment coverage, you want realignment analysis and perspective, come to Trojans Wire. We're covering it 24/7. Oh, we've generated about 50 stories over the past 48 hours or so, and we're going to continue to deliver lots of content, lots of insights on all the different realignment angles, not just USC, not just the Big Ten, not just the Pac-12. We're covering all the different angles, such as like North Carolina and Duke maybe going to the Big Ten,
right?
Oklahoma State going to the SEC. We're covering it all. We are your realignment headquarters here at Trojans Wire.
And Matt does a great job. Once we get to the actual games on the field, we'll definitely have Matt back on in the fall, breaking down stuff. You got a new coach in Oregon. You got, the big matchup in week 1, Georgia, Oregon. You got Texas, Alabama coming up early in the year as well. So we'll definitely have Matt on as we approach the college football kickoff weekend, which is Labor Day weekend, for the most part for everybody. So great work, Matt. Keep it up. Appreciate the time, man, and have a great week.
I always enjoy coming on the Powers on Sports podcast. Thank you, Jason.
All right, Matt, we'll talk to you soon, and we'll be right back on the Powers on Sports podcast.